Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session on integrating pronunciation into EAP. My name is Mark Sinnott.
My name is Yuting.
And we are going to, okay, let me just change slides. We are going to mention today's aims. First of all, we're going to discuss some issues in the teaching of pronunciation in EAP. We're going to explore some errors common among Chinese learners, and we're going to share some ideas for teaching. So here's a little chance to discuss. We're going to have a poll. I think that's the intention. We can't host polls here, but Dara is supposed to do it for us. First question: when and how often should pronunciation be taught in EAP classes? Often, as a small part of EAP class sessions. B, when the book specifies. C, when a student makes an error. Or D, never or rarely. It is not our priority in EAP. Now, maybe you can post your ideas in the chat there, A, B, C, or D.
Because now I don't think we have the function here. We don't have the permission to set up a whole set of most A.
Looks like it's totally A.
A, B, C, D.
James Major has a good comment. Hi, James. When it's included in our standardized descriptors. Yeah, we'll come back to that later. Mitchell says when you're told to do it. Okay, interesting. These are little things we'll pick up on later because we're going to discuss some approaches.
Okay.
Let's go to the next slide.
Now let's have another poll. What aspects of pronunciation should we teach? Maybe you can also type your choice in the chatting area. A, phonemes, including monophthongs, diphthongs, and consonant sounds. B, consonant clusters. C, stress and intonation. D, connected speech, for example, like linking, intrusion, etc. And E, all of them. What do you think?
I can see another pattern emerging here.
All of them. Focus
E.
on C and D.
Good, James. Focus on C and D.
Mm-hmm. D.
D, connected speech. Interesting.
C. Okay. E.
Bruce says it depends on the needs of the students. Kat says focus on A to C. There's actually a variety of answers there. The first few answers were E.
Right.
Okay, just leave that one. Before we continue, quite often our books and our materials include these. Can you see one that our intermediate and upper intermediate books hardly ever include? Can you see one of them that's almost never included? Mitchell says A.
We would agree with that.
Yeah, Aaron, it's A. If you look at common books like contemporary topics, maybe Lecture Ready or some others, they will have content on stress and intonation for sure. Connected speech features like linking and intrusion. They might have something on consonant clusters, but they hardly ever have anything on phonemes. Mitchell is right. It's expected that students are okay with phonemes already, but we know ourselves that's probably not the case. So let's have a look. Do EAP teachers actually teach pronunciation? Here is our esteemed Journal of English for Academic Purposes. And I searched for article titles in this journal. I went to their list of the most cited and the most downloaded. There are 25 articles in each list. How many articles contain the word pronunciation, do you think? Can anyone guess? Out of 25 in each list, so a total of 50 then. How many contained the word pronunciation? Mitchell and Bruce saying 0. Hangzhan is 5, Norman 3, Martina 3.
Okay, smart guess.
Smart guess is the answer is none at all. None contain the word pronunciation. And I read through to double check. We searched for the word speak, also not contained. The word speech was contained in 1, but it was the paper was related to vocabulary. So that's a bit of a failing. Something's wrong there. And we'll talk about why. So in our opinion, the EAP is not just about writing. It's why do writing-related matters cause passionate debate among EAP lecturers, but never pronunciation matters. Quite often teachers have discussions about should we have problem solution essays next year, or should we have cause and effect? When do we teach paraphrasing? How should we integrate sources? You rarely hear those discussions about speaking, and especially you don't hear them about pronunciation. So maybe that comes from the origins of EEP and the norms within it. For example, maybe we can question EAP norms and EAP teacher behaviors. Many norms stem from teaching pre-sessional courses in the UK, where the students have maybe IELTS 6.5 or 7 or above. And that's a very different context to what we have in year 1 at XJTLU. Moreover, and importantly, we cannot ethically test pronunciation if we do not teach it. And that may be a professional failure of our courses. I suspect that a lot of people here do teach a lot of pronunciation in classes, but I'm not sure if it's consistent across teachers and across modules.
Yeah, so now let's have a look at why should we teach pronunciation. First, year 1 semester 1 students, their level are usually at A2 to B1+, and they may have errors occur with very basic language. And ingrained errors may occur with common one-syllable words, probably due to their bad habits while learning pronunciation. And also, these pronunciation may co-occur with grammar or word choice errors, which can cause further confusion or loss of meaning. So imagine if your students have pronunciation errors as well as grammar or word choice errors, it might be even more difficult for people to understand what they're trying to say. Yeah, and also we believe it is critical for listening as well, if you can understand pronunciation better or if you can pronounce things better. So I'll give you an example. For example, in speaking exams, I guess some of you might have experienced this situation. So if you ask the student to say, can you say your full name in English? Some students might interpret this as phone number and begin to tell you their mobile phone number. Okay, so yeah, that's a couple of reasons why should we teach pronunciation. So now let's have a look at what problems do our students have. First aspect for learners in general. Okay, so we have looked at several aspects for learners' problems in general. Number 1, pronunciation may differ according to dialect or accent. So each speaker, they have their own language, they have their own accent or dialect. It can definitely influence their English study pronunciation. Okay, and also pronunciation may not have fixed rules, which means it's complicated. And also, one word can be stressed in 2 ways. For example, record, which is a noun, versus record, which is a verb. And this kind of rules might be difficult for students. Also, one word can have 2 different pronunciations due to different tenses or contexts. For example, read, which is the present simple tense, versus read, which is the past tense. And lead versus let, that's the same case. And that's an important one. Some sounds do not exist in students L1. For example, some cluster sounds in English, like results, which should be difficult for some students to pronounce. And we have some silent letters in English, for example, sword, subtle, mortgage. I believe this is common for learners who study English, and at least in my class, I often notice that a lot of students cannot pronounce them correctly. So for example, they can say sword or subtle or mortgage, okay, like this. And also, intrusive and linking sounds is an unfamiliar phenomenon to some of the students. For example, I agree, you are a genius, her English is excellent, etc., etc. So here we can see we have intrusive sound and linking sound like yeah, what, and ja, which is definitely unfamiliar with some of the students. And now let's have a look at what problems do students have, considering the role of the textbooks. Okay, so number one, the EAP textbooks are for global audiences and their focus may not really match local needs. I guess some of you also have the same feeling. Also, pronunciation may be treated mechanically or not at all. For example, think about the oral communication book we used for EAP 0 to 7, especially for those teachers who teach on-site classes, including me. I was confused when we get this oral communication book because I can hardly see any like pronunciation practices, but the book's name is oral communication. So I was wondering, okay, so what does that come from? And intonation aspects may be oversimplified in our textbooks. For example, for yes or no questions, books often say the intonation rises, while for WH questions, it falls. However, we also use intonation to indicate our mood, certainty, etc., etc. So for example, Mark, where do you live?
I live on Jinghu Jie.
Okay, so it's like a general question. I was using a following intonation, right? But if like Mark is complaining about the noise near his apartment, and I say, oh wait, where do you live?
I live on Jinghu Jie.
So it more indicates like I know where Mark lives before, but now it's just like I forget or I need to double check if he lives there. And another point is books often say that only stressed words carry meaning, but this is definitely untrue. For example, negatives are often unstressed, but they are essential to the meaning conveyed. Okay, so now Mark will introduce one of the studies we'll look at for the common problems our Chinese students have because they're the majority student group at XJTLU.
So we found this paper from Wu and Wang. And it was a little bit problematic, but nonetheless, it has some interesting findings. They did research on 10 Year 1 participants at Nanchang University in Jiangxi. The participants came from across China, and they recorded saying 10 sample sentences. And the sentences were analyzed using software. So the students were recorded, and also the software took images of what students did with their mouth. And that reveals some interesting features. So let's have a look at some student mistakes. Here are some words or phrases. What word is the student trying to say and what went wrong? Here's one for you. Bad habit. What went wrong there?
Bad habit.
So what went wrong?
Bad sound.
Feel free to type in the chat. What went wrong there? Meanwhile, I'll continue with a similar one.
Yeah.
Painful. What word is the student trying to say?
It should be painful. Painful versus painful.
So what mistakes are happening there? Weak and strong vowels? Yeah, kind of. Yeah, and let's go to another one. Usual.
Usual.
Okay, so we keep going. If you're talking about street directions, they might say, go straight. Go straight. What went wrong there? Okay, have a...
Diphthongs.
Diphthongs is mentioned, yeah. Yeah. Aaron is mentioned in L1 transfer. Yes. And we're going to go into the details. As Yuan says, it's the wrong vowel sounds are being used. And let's look at why. Here's the word yang, as in he is a young man.
Yeah, he's a young man, he's a young.
And also rung, the telephone rung.
telephone rang.
Yeah, the student was trying to say rang, but said rung. So the vowel sound is wrong. Do your students sound like this? Any thoughts? In these examples, either a diphthong has been shortened, or maybe the students have shifted to a schwa sound or a similar vowel. Generally, they're making life easier for themselves. And these are some specific examples from the research. Do your students make mistakes like that? Any thoughts? Please feel free to type in the chat. We've got a lot to cover today, so we might go on to some consonant errors. Similarly, here are some errors with consonants. What word is the student trying to say? Day and doe. Now, if I was home in Ireland, I would hear the same mistake. But now Mitchell is right. So of course, these words are they and though. What's happening there? I'll let you have a think about that one. Yeah, so the TH and the voiced th sound has become a d sound. Similarly, without and whether. What's happening with those? It's kind of similar, actually.
Without, whether.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so another one. This is something you walk on in a garden, a path. The student said pass. And similarly, our birthday. Mm-hmm. And another one, treasure. What did the student want to say here?
Treasure.
Yeah, the j sound has become a r. Here's a word, policing. What was the student trying to say? In this case, the student was trying to say polishing. So the sh sound has just become a s sound. Similar to before, the student wanted to say rang, the telephone rang, but said ran. What happened there? In that case, the n sound became just an n sound. Something you win. They wanted to say something you win, but they said price instead. I won a price. What happened there?
Should be prize.
Yeah, the z sound became a s sound. And lastly, language. Very obviously, what word was the student trying to say?
Language.
Language. So the l sound became a n, language. Here's a table of those results. So in most cases, the students substitute. They produce a similar sound just to make life easy for themselves. And that's typically happening because the sound doesn't exist in Chinese, or maybe in their dialect of Chinese. Yuting points out that these errors are by no means universal.
Yeah.
And they may be more common in some
certain provinces. For example, the last one, language, and some students may pronounce it as language because in certain provinces in China, I guess in Hunan province, some people cannot distinguish the sound between l and n. But definitely there are people from the province can distinguish the two sounds. So it's definitely not discrimination. Yeah, just an example.
So, and Yuan mentions Sichuan area students. I'd well believe that too.
Yeah, and polishing, I think some students from south of China cannot distinguish the sound between s and sh. So yeah, Yeah, you know what I mean.
So we focus mostly there on phonemes, but we'll also mention clusters. Consonant clusters don't exist in Chinese. On top of this, many consonant clusters in English contain the especially challenging R and L sounds. And Chinese students often add vowel sounds between consonant clusters and substitute consonant sounds that are easier for them to say. For example, pressure becomes pressure. You see, they add a little vowel sound in among the cluster. Similarly, flower becomes flower. Or students omit the sounds altogether. So words become just words, or world becomes
word or world.
World. Yeah, so you know, maybe a British English speaker might have their own way of saying that, but it seems that students would not be able to say or LD in one cluster. Moving on, we've taken some ideas from a blog post by Stevens, which is listed in our reference, and this mentions R and V sounds. Again, these two sounds don't exist in Chinese, and it's difficult for some students to form them. Cliche errors, of course, are really becomes
oui,
oui, very becomes
oui,
very, love becomes love, dark becomes dark. Again, they're struggling at the phonemic level. So how can we teach pronunciation?
Now let's look at some ways to teach pronunciation and how to integrate pronunciation into teaching and make it an integral part of most lessons, because we believe that teaching pronunciation should be integrated in most of the lessons instead of being a standalone part. So the first one, speaking as opposed to listening tasks. We know that here at Language Center, a lot of teachers, we pay a lot of attention to teaching listening, and that's good. But one problem with a lot of listening activities is that students only hear them once or twice or even 3 times, but the focus is typically to answer some comprehension questions at the end. So by doing this, we feel like this doesn't really help students with that spoken production. How can we really know that students understand the whole thing, or students can use the language from the listening, or students can even retell the story they've heard from the listening? We have no idea. So listening tasks can be reworked, we believe, to include some kind of pronunciation components. For example, you can focus on only probably a very small section, 1 or 2 lines with a specific focus. So for example, when you complete a listening activity, you can simply give students part of the transcript, or you can give them all of the transcript, depends on yourself, okay, your choice, and get them to act it out in pairs. Students usually like this, I feel, especially for those extrovert learners, and these kind of students can usually activate the atmosphere in the classroom. So it's quite nice. And here is an activity Mark adapted from the oral communication book. Mark, do you want to explain it?
Yeah, so we felt there wasn't enough focus on pronunciation and features of connected speech and so on in the oral comm book. So we cooked up some slides and activities based on the activities in the book. Here is a transcript, and this has been colored in purple and red. Can anyone tell me, what does the purple color show? Any suggestions? Some of you guys might have taught this, of course, you might remember it. It has words like archaeologist and, coming on, look at, looks at, and example is these ancient. Yeah, connected speech. What feature? Yeah, Bo mentioned liaison. Yeah, we can call it liaison or linking. It's consonant to vowel linking, field of, and so on. Similarly, the red. What's happening with the red
Today is.
Today, study of.
Today is.
To understand. I'll give you a clue. To understand.
Really
We are.
is.
Intravowel consonants. It's not omission. Yeah, I haven't. Yeah, I would call it an intrusive sound, but I think that's what Aaron means. Yeah, it's the intrusive w, y, and r sounds. Now, let's mention the mechanics. When you teach, you might want to consider the mechanics of speaking. And I confess, this is something I do with some phonemes, and I could probably do a bit more of it. I think for this year, I can probably have a try. I think only demonstration is not enough. We can exaggerate how we show students the sounds of English. And I'd say never be afraid of being stupid in your classroom. That's a quote from Adrian Underhill. The th sound does not exist in Chinese, so how is it made? You could take a look at Adrian Underhill's YouTube series for more pronunciation teaching videos. He's got about 40 of these that goes through sounds in detail. It would be quite useful to play these for students, I think. They're very brief. An example might be this consonant here, th, and he mentions just to think of the th sound, say it. You're using your top teeth and the bottom lip. The tongue is doing nothing, lying at the bottom. But as you say the th sound, bring the tip of your tongue forward and up, and that creates the th sound very easily. And if you add voice to that sound, you can create the other th sound in English. And that's very useful. In his blog posts, he often compares the voiced and unvoiced pairs, and how once you find one of them, it's quite easy to find the other just by switching your voice on and off. And that's something that he believes is a very good tool for teaching students. Following what we see about consonant clusters, you might want to think about working on those sounds in isolation to begin with, and at a word level, and moving on to the words in connected speech. We know that if a student cannot say one of the phonemes in the cluster, then it's unlikely they'll pronounce the cluster sound correctly. Aaron mentions a good point that nobody teaches minimal pairs before, but they're useful. Quite often, what's old and works shouldn't be discarded. I totally agree with you, Aaron. I've been preparing some materials on this, and minimal pairs would definitely be part of it. Continuing.
Okay, now let's have a look at another activity, which we call it odd phoneme out. So you can simply give students a group of 4 words and ask them which one is the odd one, which means which one does not contain the same phoneme. For example, the first set of words, work, turn, must, her, and you need to ask the student which one does not have the same phoneme. And the second set, grow, now, soap, toe, which one is the out one? Okay, and here are the answers. I usually find this kind of activities useful and engaging, at least in my class, because we give students this kind of words. Usually, students will immediately start pronouncing these words, no matter to themselves or to their partners. So it's quite engaging. And this activity works best with vowels. And we suggest that you could simply adapt these kind of materials and use it as a very simple warm-up activity at the very beginning. So students get the chance to speak at the very beginning, which is nice, what we want. And the next one, which is a game, we call it dictation computer game. And this is taken from a classic pronunciation book. So you can have a look. We have some sentences on the left and some sentences on the right. So on the left, you can see some phrases that the computer misheard. And on the right, you can see the mashed responses with the question or with the sentences on the left. Okay, so what did the speaker say and why did the computer hear it wrongly? So for example, let's look at the first sentence on the left. I don't like green. And if you look at C on the right, which is the matched response, it says, well, do you like blue? So what did the speaker say actually? I don't like green. What's wrong with it?
A feature of pronunciation caused a problem here.
What the speaker was trying to say is, I don't like green. Yeah? And it's because there is an omission of sound, because usually when we have two consonant sounds together, it's very difficult for us to pronounce every consonant sound. So you probably just say, I don't like green, and it's and the sound is just omitted. So that's why the computer at that time, couldn't really distinguish the sound between and couldn't really make any inference based on the context. Okay. And now in the classroom, you can probably just do it in a very simple way. For example, you can simply ask students to record their voices using their mobile phone, using Siri, and see if Siri can understand what they're trying to say. And it's usually a lot of fun in class because students usually like these kind of activities in which technology is involved. Okay.
So a lot of those are down to assimilation.
So here are the answers. If you would like to use this activity, you can have a look.
The first one was, I don't like green, but of course it should be, I don't like green. The others have similar errors. For example, he said, rang quickly. Of course, it should be ran quickly, and so on.
Yeah. Okay. Next, let's have a look at another activity which talks about marking the word stress. Okay, so this is a very simple activity you can do in your class, and a lot of teachers here, we actually pay a lot of attention on word stress, right? So say a word and ask students to count the syllables. For example, when you teach the word photograph and photography, okay, you can ask them how many syllables are there in the two words. And then repeat the words and ask students to mark the stressed syllable. For example, you can ask them to use the dot to indicate where the stressed syllable is. And this often occurs in academic words as well. For example, physics and physician. So I believe it's worth teaching the word stress on different syllables. It's very useful. Okay. Another area we actually pay a lot of attention to is sentence stress. So here is a possible activity you can do in your class. You can choose some short phrases or sentences from a listening activity or speaking activity and then put them on the board. And what you can do next is, first time when you read the sentence, try not to put any stress on any of the words, okay? So each syllable in this sentence receives the same length and pitch and stress, okay? And the second time when you read the sentence, you try to use natural stress, okay? Try to sound natural. And the third time when you read it, you can stress every third word in this sentence, or you can totally do it randomly, like stress any of the words in the sentence randomly. And then you can ask students about what they noticed. Probably they might say they feel more comfortable listening to which one, probably the second one. And then you can ask past practice, saying these sentences using natural stress. Okay, now let's look at another useful game which is called fishing for stress patterns. And you can use it while talking about sentence stress.
Yeah, so after a difficult day of teaching pronunciation, you may feel like going fishing. So you could try to trap one of these fish in the pool. And you can do that by finding phrases that pattern with each other, sentences and phrases. So, for example, wait and look are partners because they have only one syllable. On the left of the screen, you can see 11 different stress patterns. And what you can do is find the partners among the 22 stones or sentences on the right. And when you draw lines between them, eventually you'll trap one of the fish. And unfortunately, you can see the answers here. It's a bad day for fish B because he's been caught. He's been circled by all these lines. We've got some links there between begin and she talked, who cares and don't stop, don't worry and keep quiet. The purpose of showing you this is that it's a little bit of a classic type of activity, but it's worth restoring to the consciousness. Yeah, as Aaron says, some of these activities like minimal pairs and so on, they become a bit old-fashioned sometimes, but they're still useful. I think sometimes we try and reinvent the wheel with teaching, and for all our use of technology, sometimes these still have a place. Anyway. We can also mention expressing feelings.
For example, choose a few short phrases or sentences and write them up on the board. For example, what are you doing? What do you mean? I'll see you later, etc., etc. So you can basically ask students to practice saying these sentences out, but using different feelings. For example, if you feel angry or if you feel happy, if you feel upset, things like that. Students usually like this kind of interesting stuff. Yeah. And students can write up a few feelings, for example, like angry, tired, worried, excited, etc., etc. Okay, and student can choose one sentence and then try to say it in a way that expresses each feeling. So you can do it one by one. And you can model this for your students by reading out example sentences using 2 or 3 of the feelings. Ask students to guess which feeling you're showing through your intonation, stress, tone, etc., etc. And this might seem a bit like general English, but we also pay a lot of attention to intonation, and especially in the speaking exam, we focus on intonation as well. So we believe we have to teach them something about intonation if we're going to evaluate on this criteria. Okay, and I believe that's the last one, raising learner awareness.
So there is some debate about what you need to teach students in terms of pronunciation, but I think activities will be more effective if students are aware of their importance and what they're actually trying to achieve. Often students are unaware of problems or misidentify the problem. For example, they're focused on producing a particular sound when the problem is to do with stress. Or another common example might be if they're listening and they say, oh, the thing was too fast. That was a terrible exam. It might be that the listening is not so fast, but the students were confused by connected speech. The other thing is, if you routinely talk about pronunciation and teach the appropriate meta-language, it helps deal with such issues. And this can occur throughout the lesson or during specific correction activities. I don't think students necessarily need to know all the terminology. I think in EAP, sometimes teachers have a tendency to give too much the terminology, and we sometimes teach things that students don't really need to know. Similarly, with pronunciation, they don't need to know everything, but it's good to be aware of the features like intrusive sounds and so on, the role of the schwa and so on. Another thing to mention is a little bit of debate about what level we should teach these at. because initially Yuting and I had some disagreements, I think, about certain features. In some courses, as we mentioned earlier, you know, in high-level courses, they don't really focus on the single phonemes. But as we know, our students in year 1 who are supposed to be going into B2 and and learning from upper intermediate books, they often have problems with phonemes. And we've seen several examples today that are quite plausible in an XJTLU context. So maybe we can open that as a question later about when should we teach pronunciation. We'll come to some conclusions. We think that integrating pronunciation into EAP classes empowers learners. And students and teachers should see it as integral, not simply an add-on, filler, or prescribed book page. Conventional pronunciation teaching often involves just listening and repeating, but this doesn't show students the physicality, and therefore they cannot gain control. This is an opinion strongly held by Adrian Underhill, and I think it's very plausible. We need to show students the mechanics. There's no point just repeating the words. So the final point, as a strategy, we suggest that varied activity types, judicious focus on targeted aspects of pronunciation, such as the errors we identified earlier, demonstrating the mouth mechanics, increased learner awareness, and incorporation of lively ideas can help. So we've got some references to share with you guys later. We think these are quite interesting. So do you have any questions? Any questions or any thoughts or observations? We have less than 10 minutes, by the way. We've got about 7, I make it. I'm really glad we got a good turnout this afternoon. We've got 48 participants, which I think is very healthy indeed. Well done, Yuting.
Well done, Mark.
No, well done to you, Yuting. So Darlene mentions that pronunciation is popular in CS. Okay, thanks for Yuan's comment, very practical activities. I think we aim to show a range of activities here, and there were some others that we could have mentioned as well. Aaron mentions, I think it's difficult to carve out room in the curriculum for pronunciation when teachers feel so much pressure to cover other material. I think that's part of our experience in XJTLU. I think that mostly the material you're referring to, Aaron, is probably material relating to writing coursework. We do have a lot of backwash here. And unfortunately, the writing coursework often tends to dictate a little bit too much of what we teach, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Aaron said. We have too many to cover in each lesson, and being mentioned that being asked the question, how should teachers decide on what to focus in each lesson? So I think that's the point of having today's session, because me and Mark were trying to say something about integrating pronunciation into daily teaching. So we feel like teaching pronunciation should not be a standalone lesson. For example, we don't think you should spend about 15 minutes or even 2 hours teaching pronunciation, but it should be integrated into each of the lesson. For example, when I got the chance to observe other teachers' lessons, I usually found that teachers don't really pay a lot of attention to students' pronunciation errors if they can understand the students. But I think if teachers can correct pronunciation errors made by the students on the spot, I think it could be helpful as far as yeah, at least from my experience, I think students love it. And students, sometimes I know some students don't like being corrected because it's kind of embarrassing. But we do have some students really love to be corrected, and they want to have this kind of pronunciation correction because they know they have to improve their pronunciation. So yeah, I think that's what me and Mark were trying to say throughout the session. We try to integrate pronunciation teaching, like bit by bit in each lesson.
Do people generally agree with us that pronunciation is overlooked? I know we gave one example of a journal with insufficient mention of pronunciation. Looks like we've got an agreement in here.
And me and Mark, actually, we had a conversation about drilling the other day. So we feel like not many teachers are doing drilling in the classroom. So Mark said some teachers might probably think it's childish, but actually I do a lot of drilling for my class, and I usually found students enjoy having drilling activity. And you can actually make drilling fun. For example, in my class, I usually ask them to pronounce certain words all together as a whole class, and then I probably pick each student individually, ask them to pronounce the words, because you don't really know if every student can pronounce the word correctly if you often drill the whole class. So this is something you can think of. And also I think Mark had some good ideas on drilling, to make drilling fun, more fun. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, we were talking a lot about tongue twisters, and there are quite a few good ones for use in ELT. You know, the famous one, how much wood would a woodchuck chuck?
Yeah.
If a woodchuck could chuck wood.
Yeah. And I think you also mentioned you drilled the students, you probably divide them into different groups, and girls say this and boys say this, is that correct?
Yeah, when I taught teenagers in summer camps in the UK, I used to have this little technique where we would drill something, maybe a sentence or a phrase, chorally with the whole class, and then again, and then maybe split boys, and then girls' turn, and then people with glasses, and then people who like Lady Gaga, and people who like bicycles, and just try to make it increasingly silly. But the students found it quite funny. Yeah, there's some good comments in the chat. Martina Dorn mentions the brilliant comedy sketch from the Two Ronnies TV show, Four Candles or Four Candles. That's a great one. It's a classic comedy sketch from a TV show from about 1970 something. A man goes into a shop and asks for 4 candles. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah.
They usually like listening to teachers saying these tongue twisters. At least in my class, I think they do. And one thing I usually do with my class is I use tongue twisters as a warm-up. So for example, you can give the tongue twisters to, you can have 2 tongue twisters, and then you can divide the class into 2 groups, and you can give each group 1 tongue twister, and you can ask them to whisper one to the other, and then probably at the end of the game, you can drill the tongue twister as a whole class, and then if you ask the student to whisper the tongue twister one by one, and finally the last person who hears the tongue twister, they need to go to the front of the room and then write down tongue twister, and usually you have some funny results. So it's quite fun to use some kind of tongue twisters as a warm-up with students. Homophone.
Martina mentions hominin jokes.
Homonyms, yes, definitely.
Yeah, I've seen some good ones of these recently. Just going back to the point earlier about time, I agree that there's a lot of backwash here, but I do wonder if everyone maximizes the 100 minutes of each class, instead of waiting 2 minutes to let students come in, just start with a warmer or a simple pronunciation activity, then I think that can help. But if overall we lift the standard of our students as they progress from semester 1 to semester 2, then hopefully that makes the progress in semester 2 and onwards quicker, because they're better. And your lessons don't get bogged down by breakdowns in communication. I think there's a room to incorporate pronunciation somewhere. But yes, I agree, there's a lot of backwash.
Thanks, Donnie, for sharing a good link on the book for tongue twisters.
Okay, I think we have to wrap up quite soon.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any final comments? Okay, thanks, Dominic, for coming. Yeah. Thanks to everyone for coming, indeed.
Yeah, thank you, guys.
Hope you found it useful.
Hope you can use some of the activities we suggest.
Yeah, and I certainly don't pretend to be a phonetics expert, but I hope everyone got enough out of this session today. Aaron mentions it would be nice to get some of these books in room 544. I've got several good PDF versions of useful pronunciation books. Pronunciation Games is one. Ship or Sheep is another.
How to Teach Pronunciation, the yellow one.
Is good. Sound Foundations, I've also got that. And I'm happy to share those with anyone who likes. In the reference list, there is a link to some useful blog posts also from One Stop English. If you need access to One Stop English, I'm happy to share that as well. Some of those blog posts are really worthwhile. The Adrian Tennant link is actually a series of blogs. Integrating pronunciation is just one of them.
Okay. I think we have to leave some time for them to for the all-staff meeting. Okay, thank you guys very much. Thank you guys for coming.
Thanks very much, guys. And let's hope this is the beginning of something.